Fair play, right? So Mark Ennis covered for me last week while I was home under the weather, and I'm covering for Mark Sunday evening while he is at Lads to Leaders. So like to say, turnabout's fair play. I'll butcher your class just as well as you butchered mine. They have their homework, that's right. But thank you for covering it. It was short notice. We'll continue thinking about the Israelites relative to a cultural, social, political context. And as we kick things off tonight, first let's go to God in prayer, ask His blessings on our study, and then we'll get started. Our God and our Father in heaven, we are thankful for your blessings of the time here where we can come together as your children and open your word. We ask, Father, that you open our minds and our hearts to the message you have for us. We ask that we take that message, and in all things that we do, we live lives that glorify you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. So 4 weeks ago, we started this current quarter class, and I made the comment that I had no intention of referring to the Bible solely as a history book. And what I meant by that is that, the message of the Bible transcends the historical aspects. There is a history component to the Bible. That's part of the basis for our discussion, recognizing that these are biblical events, and they took place in real times with real people. So these are biblical events, but I didn't want to minimize the message that God has for us by looking at His Word solely as a history book. Now, after that class, it was pointed out to me that the person making the comment understood the point I was trying to make. But they correctly pointed out that there is a certain aspect of the Bible that is historical in nature. And God, through His Spirit, gave us His Word as He intended. And the historical aspects that are there are intentional. They are by His design. And that got me to thinking about it, because the person who made that observation is correct. There is a historical aspect to it, and we should, I think if we're being fair to the text, we should learn from that history that's provided for us. That's why it's there, for our benefit, for our learning. So tonight, next week, and probably the following week, that is much of the starting point for where I'm coming from with the discussion. Recognizing that there is a historical aspect, particularly as we think about the people of God and the concept of state as a sovereign nation. The people of God, the Israelites, as they, the patriarchal age before the Exodus, and then following the Exodus, and then in the time of the kings, there is this concept of state. And on one blush, I think it would be easy to just recognize correctly that God chose the Israelites to be His chosen people. God had certain expectations for them as His chosen people. God expected them to obey His commands, and God promised to bless them. And it's, at some level, it really is no more complicated than that. And I want to recognize that up front, because that really is, I think, the correct big picture. But going back to the comment about the history book, the history is there for our learning, and I think that it might be worth our time to dig a little deeper into Israel as a state, as a sovereign nation, even starting before they became a nation, and understanding then their relationship with God as His chosen people, and then their relationship with themselves and everybody else around them as a nation. And it's It's a study I've found very interesting because there's a lot of tension between Israel, the chosen people of God, and Israel and their desire to be a nation similar to those nations around them. There's a lot of tension. And here's where I think it's especially important. Mark, going back to a comment you made in our first class, right? How much of this do we want to extrapolate and pull forward and apply to us today? That's been in my head all along. And I think that tonight, next week, and the following week, there's a lot of opportunity for us to make that application. Because I think that it's appropriate for us to look at the Israelites as an analog for our own situation. What I mean by that is they were God's chosen people. We are, in a very similar way, God's chosen. We are God's elect. They relied on God's promise. We rely on God's promise. They understood the requirement to live subject to God's law. We understand that same requirement. So there's a lot of similarity. In fact, I've come to appreciate how God and his relationship with Israel really represents a foreshadowing of God's relationship with us. Right, so I think that it's well worth our time to dig deeper into this concept of the people of God and how they wrestled with their statehood, their national identity, be it socially, culturally, politically. Most of what we'll talk about tonight and next week will be more in the political sphere. And then, again, by application, what can we take from that as God's people here on earth, the church, and how do we learn lessons that they should have learned in terms of understanding God's expectations, understanding God's, not just his laws and his commands, but understanding the why behind them. And this is often where I think they miss the point, right? Because had they understood the why, then the what would have, I think, come much easier. So we, just like they, have an obligation, I think, to monitor and to build and to tear down where necessary and rebuild our own cultural identity in the image of God, which is no different than what God was asking the Israelites to do back then. A lot of what I'm going to share with you comes from an article written in 1988 by a gentleman named Christopher J.H. Wright. I recognize that this is conversations we've had before, largely. Maybe this will be a little bit of a deeper dive than we generally take. But I thought this article was interesting because it breaks down this idea of the people of God in the Old Testament and the relationship to the state themselves as a national identity. And it breaks it down based on period. So the period of the patriarchs, and then the period following the Exodus, and then the period of the kings, which is probably where we'll stop. I think we'll get the point. But then it goes on, actually, and looks at their concept of state once they were in exile, and then the remnant that comes back and rebuilds the temple, all the way up through the time of Christ. So this article breaks it down into those 5 chunks of history within the Israelite nation. But it was written in 1988 by a gentleman named Christopher J.H. Wright. So there's not a whole lot I can take for credit for myself. So let's dig in. So with the Bible as our starting point, right, when we read through the Old Testament, we start to quickly understand that there is, in fact, a God-given order to things. God created the world and everything in it. And put into place an order in terms of how things will work. God is a God of order. And then all of this arises from God's intention. And then that's one of my favorite words here is intentional, or being intentional about things. God was obviously very intentional about things. And just as God breathed life into mankind, right, God also in his time established his intended social and cultural order for Israel. Now, as you kind of fast forward through history, you get through Noah, you come up to the time of Abraham, and you see where God chooses Abraham. Let's go to Genesis 18, verse 19. Genesis 18, verse 19. When someone gets there, please just read it.
Justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him.
Thank you, Roy. So God chooses Abraham. He calls Abraham out, and God uses Abraham as the cornerstone for everything else that's going to happen going forward. Right? Israel's cultural cornerstone was hewn with Abraham being called by God. And this being called out is important because God called Abraham to live differently. And God specifically asked that Abraham live according to God's commands. God expected that Abraham would teach his children. So there's this idea of passing along this concept of social and cultural values from one generation to the next. And in return, God made a promise to Abraham that his offspring would become a great nation. And again, I get it. This is not necessarily new information for us. But I wanted to level set because that's the point where we start to set the context for what comes next in terms of thinking about how God expected Israel to develop socially and culturally. All right, so now let's go to Leviticus 20. Leviticus 20, verses 7 and 8.
Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. And you shall keep my statutes and perform them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you.
Consecrate yourselves therefore, for I am holy. Is that what it said, Ed? And be holy. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy. Finish the thought. Why? For I am the Lord your God. So this idea in Leviticus 20, verses 7 and 8, is this notion of being called out. And we start to introduce the word holy. And we're going to spend some time on that word. But God is telling Israel there, be holy. Consecrate yourself. Be holy. Why? Because God is holy. And then as we read through Leviticus, the book of law, we see that not only is God holy, but God ties his laws to being holy. And Israel's obedience to these laws is part of what makes them holy, because it's part of what sets them apart. Just like Abraham had been called out by God, God's commands is part of what sets the Israelites apart from everyone else around them. And so at this point, I'm making an assumption that it's the nation's laws that are generally driven by a set of underlying forces, cultural or social forces. You know, and it's a little bit of a chicken or egg thing. I was thinking about this later today. It is a little bit of a chicken or egg, right? Is it the laws that made Israel holy, or is it Israel's holiness that prompted that the law be put into place? You know, and Jamie, you're shaking your head. What's that?
God chose Israel. It wasn't because of their holiness. They didn't earn that any more than we earn our own salvation. I think that's clear the lesson through the whole book.
And that's the conclusion I came to as well. God chose Israel, and God drew Israel out. Any holiness from Israel is bestowed on them by God. He chose them in spite of who they were, yeah. But play that out. Play it out. Play out the line of thinking. So if you do, then you realize we're forced to consider the laws, God's law, not just for what they allowed or prohibited. The law is not there just to say you must do X or you must not do Y. Rather, since the law is based on holiness, God's holiness, the law is there to help Israel understand the why. Israel, be holy, because I, your God, am holy. You are my chosen people. You be holy, because I am holy. The law is there, and then by extension, the social and cultural dynamics that should have come out of that are there as an expression of holiness. Holiness is the underlying cultural value. That makes sense? What are your thoughts?
Not just as we would think of it, I think we have to be in the essence of God. We're set apart, we're different. So our lives should be like His life.
Think about how baptism is described. You go into the waters of baptism, and you come up a new person, a new creature, something fundamentally different than you were prior to immersion. And I think that the older I get, the more astounded I become that the central themes of the Bible are actually relatively very few. There's actually a simplicity to God's message. When you start to think about it, you start to think this idea of Israel acting as if they had been chosen because the underlying value is one of God's holiness. They are to reflect God's holiness. God choosing them made them something different than everyone else in the world. Abraham, as a single man, being called out, was literally different at that point than everyone else on earth. Simply because God called him out. I'll borrow the language from the New Testament. He was at that point a new creature. Right? You see how the themes are relatively few when you really start to boil it down into its most basic forms. We are materially, substantially different after our baptism than before. Israel was materially, substantially different than everyone else around them because of God's holiness and God's intent that through the laws and commands that He expected them to obey, Israel would be different than everyone else around them. So the point I'm trying to make here, right, is that Israel's cultural foundation was made because of what the law intended for them to accomplish, which was demonstrating holiness. God called Israel to be a holy nation, and Israel's holiness was demonstrated by their adaptation of and following God's laws. Israel was expected to implement God's intended social, cultural, legal, and political order.
I don't disagree, but I think there's something to the standpoint that, and we see it throughout Scripture, is that Israel at points implemented what God said to the letter and completely missed the spirit. So, he said, I don't want sacrifices anymore because you're cutting the throats of your fellow man. It's kind of, I want mercy, I want justice, and yet, don't give me any more sacrifices until you get those things right. And I think that was where, Israel tended to get caught up in the law and the letter aspects of things and forgot what God was really asking for.
Absolutely. That's why Jesus, when asked what's the greatest command, love God and love others. That's
But everything else falls into place.
Everything else falls
But they were trying to get everything else right, and they forgot about that piece of it.
So, Mark, the point you're making is that they got the letter of the law, even to the point where the religious elite used the letter of the law against those that they were supposed to be. Used it for oppression. And you're exactly making the point I want you to take away from, right, is that the intent was one of holiness. The intent was to reflect the nature of God in a very dark world. And, 2 weeks ago, that was the purpose of all the maps that I showed you 2 weeks ago, is so that you had a full appreciation of the fact that Israel was sitting right there in the middle of everyone else. Even the trade routes went directly through Israel. That's the point for all of those maps. They weren't sitting in some faraway corner of the world. And I ended that class with a quick reference to Romans, be in the world, but not of the world. Again, the simplicity of God's message is astounding to me, Mark.
Well, it starts even before that, and I don't know, we often think of the Israelite nation being in captivity for 400 years. But if you really think about it, they went into Egypt, it was Jacob and his family. So it was a family unit that went into Egypt. They weren't a nation, they were a family unit. And it took them 400 years to become a nation. And so they grew as a nation under Egyptian influence and Egyptian culture. So when they came out of Egyptian culture, if you will, that's why you have, Moses goes up on the mountain and they make a gold calf. So they're, other than what probably little bit they've carried forward from Jacob and that generation that entered Egypt, they're about as far away as you can get at that point in time. And we see it throughout the wilderness wanderings.
Any other comment? So I have a note here. To say, I guess, the same thing in a different way, we're really distinguishing between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, right? You've heard that phrase before. I think that correctly captures it. But I don't want to lose the point. God clearly expected Israel's social institutions to evolve from a culture of holiness. Now, I've used the term holy a lot, and it prompted me to go back and do a little word search. I came across a Hebrew word, kodesh, Kodesh. You're shaking your head. Anyone else familiar with that? Kodesh, Kodesh. And it is the word often translated in our Bibles as holy. But there's a nuance to that word that I think is something we should appreciate here. Because it's not just holy in terms of separate from. Right? You can take something, a valuable antique, and put it in a museum, and in a sense, that antique is made holy because it is separated from, it is set aside. And that would be correct. But there's a part B to what the word means, which is set aside for a purpose, set aside for a reason. And I appreciate that nuance because it helps us understand then what God was really calling Abraham to do. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, up through Moses and the Exodus. He was calling them out of the existing world. Right? They were being given a new identity for a purpose. And that purpose was so that God can demonstrate what it means to be God with a chosen people. And all of the promises and all of the expectations that go along with that relationship. So now you can see, as we start to think about it in those terms, God and the chosen people of Israel and how that dynamic was supposed to have played out helps us understand what it means to be God's chosen people today, His church. I think in very direct terms, just as Israel was expected to be holy and reflect God's holiness, so should we. Right? It's kind of obvious to state the obvious. But we have to recognize also that God calling Abraham was hundreds of years prior to God fulfilling that promise. And so this call to be holy was also a call to be faithful. We understand that. We understand that this life is temporal. We understand the looking forward to our eternal life in heaven with God forever. We understand the concept of a promise of something better. So all of it fits together. Someone go to Genesis 15, verses 12 through 15. Genesis 15, 12 through 15. Just whoever gets there, read it, please.
Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, for they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age.
So God is telling Abraham, and we'll use the word sojourner. Same word, different, same meaning, different word. God is telling Abraham, you will be a sojourner. You and your people are going to be physically located somewhere where you don't really belong. Even still, God expected obedience. And God expected, like we read earlier, God expected that Abraham would teach his children this concept of God's holiness as a matter of faith. And we're starting to get to what I want to leave you with as the main point for tonight, which is really, as you think about Israel of the Old Testament and their concept of state, you can't separate Israel as a state from Israel as God's chosen people. And God didn't expect them to separate that. In spite of their geographic location, surrounded by the entire rest of the world, and all of the other gods and sacrifices and child sacrifices, in spite of everything around them, God expected them to develop socially and culturally in a way that demonstrated holiness. Recognizing that they were misplaced to begin with. They were sojourners. They were pilgrims. So if God expected that of the Israelites, right, then what does he expect from us? If the Israelites are an analog for us as God's chosen people, what does God expect? I mean, it's there in the Old Testament for our benefit, for our learning. What should we be learning? Sorry, worship? Can you expand on that?
That he is first in our life, and we give him honor and praise for who he is, for every decision that he makes is correct.
That he is first in our lives, that we give him honor and praise for who he is. Okay. Mark?
That we're not home yet.
We're not home yet. Okay.
We have been promised a land elsewhere, just like the Israelites were. And we are sojourners on this planet. And our purpose here is to be holy on this planet until we are given the land that we've been promised.
Our purpose is to be sojourners. Holy. Yes.
What you just said, purpose is to be holy, back with a few minutes ago when we were talking about that the Israel people, they got wrapped up in following the rules and forgot the holiness. If you look at, Sermon on the Mount as an example from Jesus, it was, we need to get back to the holiness. It's, you've got a rule, do not murder, but I say you should not hate. So it's what's beneath those rules. It's the holiness that we should be focusing on. Get that to get the other.
Well, what's beneath the rule is the holiness. That's what we need to focus on. Yep. Ken?
The holiness, just as the nation of Israel was holy, we today too should be holy, because we're sanctified and set apart, just as the nation of Israel was. So we have to be mindful of it in our walk, that we walk in a state that's holy. Not that we're perfect, but we're holy because we're set apart from the rest of the world. And if we don't see that, then we fall in the same trap that the nation of Israel did. They lost sight of the holiness and became accustomed to the things that surrounded them.
So let me challenge you just a little bit. Carry that the one step further. We are holy. We're called to be holy. But go back to the definition, holy for a purpose. So articulate that purpose.
Our purpose is, back to Keith's comment, worship, our service to the Lord. So in our actions of being holy, we separate ourselves by the walk that we walk, the way that we talk, the way we act, because we're separate from the rest of the world. We're holy. We're a distinct group of people. As it says, you're a royal priesthood. So we should be different, walk circumspectly in how we conduct ourselves.
Thank you. I have in my notes here referencing back to Sodom and Gomorrah as a way of drawing strong contrast between what God was trying to get from the Israelites and the world in which they lived. We read in Genesis where Lot is, at Sodom and Gomorrah. God has proclaimed that he's going to destroy the cities. And the text at that point is largely focused on sins of a sexual nature. But there are other references in the New Testament that talk about the pride of life, the living in an overabundant society, and the sins that come along with the overabundance that those cities enjoyed, air quotes, enjoyed. Genesis 18:19, we won't go there, but I'll just make reference to it, where, even in that environment, Abraham was to imitate the character of God. So while God judged Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham was being told to commit to righteousness. Abraham was told to commit to justice. And that, when you start to look at the contrast between God's expectation of Abraham and these cities, you start to really understand then how God didn't care where Abraham happened to live. God expected Abraham to reflect his holiness and to teach his children to reflect holiness, not just obey the law, but to reflect the holiness. We could also talk about the Tower of Babel. As you think about the culture from which the Tower of Babel grew, it was obviously a culture of extreme self-confidence, a sense of pride of life, pride in themselves, and then God calling Abraham to have a submissive obedience to God. Right? And again, to compare and contrast what the patriarchs were being called to, or how they were being called to live, and the peoples around them, and how they were very, very different points of view. So, holiness is set apart for a reason, and the threat facing the patriarchs is that they would adopt the social and cultural practices around them. I would wrap up that line of thinking pointing back to Lot's wife. It said that, as Sodom and Gomorrah were being destroyed, she looked back and was changed to a pillar of salt. And I think that we understand, maybe some reading between the lines, but I think we understand that her looking back was more than just a simple curiosity on what was happening. That there was in her own heart a culture, a personal culture, that longed for what she was supposedly running from. Right? That I think is the real sin. It's that longing for. And that, of course, as we know, is always a danger that the Israelites faced going forward. See, I feel like we've got about 1 minute left. So let's just wrap up. Hopefully, tonight helps understand what it means to be God's people, what it means to know as God's people that God will keep his promises, and what it means to be culturally distinct from those around us, separate from the world. I mean, in the world, but not of the world. Separate from it, both in terms of what we do and an understanding of why we do it, the holiness. Any final thoughts?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think when it comes to being holy, we need to be obedient, right? Like when you have truth, knowledge, and wisdom, then it's pure. You have to be obedient to it. And somewhere in 1 Peter chapter 1, It says little children need to be obedient, or be obedient children, not conforming to your past lust, yourselves to the lust, when you were ignorant. And when you're ignorant of truth, and you're ignorant of pure truth, even a little bit of fake or falseness into a true story makes it not a true story. So if we want to be holy, we have to be obedient to, when God said walk 7 times, then walk 7 times. When he says dip in the Jordan, you dip in the Jordan. To stay holy, we must be obedient, because if we taint the truth, then we're just doing it. You know, it became a part where they were just doing sacrifices because it was just habit, or because they just thought it was going to be right. We could do the same thing when we come in here and we just take communion, but we're not being obedient to what the word says before you even take communion. So it's to be holy, to be righteous, it calls for children to be obedient.
It's both. It's a cause to be obedient because you are holy. You act differently for a purpose. Is that the spirit of what you're saying? Yeah. Well, that's the spirit of what I'm trying to get across. Good. Mission accomplished. Yay! So I've actually sat in sermons. I won't tell you where. But the title of the sermon was, What's Right with the Church of Christ? And I'll be honest, all I got out of it was a self-serving, we're better than everybody else because we do this, this, and this. And I'll leave you with that story because I think that is, unfortunately, probably well-meaning, but was unfortunately such an example of what we're talking about here. The Israelites were expected to live differently because they were holy. They were expected to live differently to reflect God's holiness. As Harry pointed out, we live differently. We obey because we are a different creature post our baptism. We are holy. Therefore, we are different. And it's not a matter of obeying the letter of the law. It is. It is. It is. God said, don't touch the ark, and Uzzah touched the ark, and Uzzah died. That's, the letter of the law. But God clearly expected Israel, and I think he clearly expects us to understand both the what and the why, and be motivated by both the what and the why. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you.